There's a weird thing that happens with movies that do okay at the box office. You see, if you have a smash hit, well, then the next step is obvious. Full-blown theatrical sequel. But what if a movie is only moderately profitable? Or hell, maybe it wasn't even profitable at all. But at the very least, it garnered a name for itself. The interest isn't really there for another theatrical installment. However, not milking a potential franchise for all it's worth clearly isn't an option. So that means it's time to switch targets and home in on the home video market. With a change in scope, we begin to see a strange phenomena. All these cult classics that are often held in fairly high regard have multiple direct sequels that no one cares about. Saying that is even generous. Most of the time, people are completely unaware that any of these sequels exist at all. But can you blame them? A lot of these movies are some of the most cynical cash grabs you can find. They often just rehash the plot from their predecessor in an inferior fashion, and with a quarter of the budget, if that. Plus very few recurring cast members, or none at all. The whole point of these was basically to fill shelves of movie rental shops. A forgotten practice leading to a bunch of forgotten films. Starship Troopers sequels are no different. I haven't heard one peep about either of these films. I thought I heard some blanket criticism of 2, but I racked my brain and I realized it wasn't directed at 2, but that first animated movie. I've actually owned these films for years. I got this DVD pack from Goodwill in high school, but the only reason I did that was just to watch the first movie. And I just ignored the other 2. I figured the rest were just shitty cash grabs that weren't worth my time, but I've since decided I should try and give them a chance. And a big reason for this is because I eventually read the book. Now, there isn't really an easy way of broaching the topic of the more controversial aspects of this franchise, but I'll try and keep it simple, at least for now. Basically, the book isn't satirical or comedic. It takes itself very seriously. Now here's the rub. When anyone who's only seen the movie hears that the book does in fact take itself completely seriously, they just automatically assume it's unadulterated fascist propaganda, because that's how the movie paints the Federation. However, the movie is not a direct adaptation of the book. It changes a lot of things, and chief among those changes is to rewrite the context around a lot of the concepts of the book in order to make them look fascist. I am of the opinion that Starship Troopers is a bit of a failure in this regard, but I'll expand more on those thoughts when we talk about 3. Right now I'm basically giving an extremely long-winded explanation as to why I more or less don't care if expanded Starship Troopers media forgoes the satire angle. Which is a good thing, because the first movie on the docket, Starship Troopers 2: Hero of the Federation, does just that. Now, I must admit, even going in with an open mind, I didn't have very high expectations for this one. Like I said earlier, I knew nothing about it whatsoever. The only exposure I had were a few very shoddy looking frames. From what little I saw, I was convinced this was going to be a movie with all its production value shoved to the intro and maybe the end of the film. And the rest of it was going to be just a bunch of people talking in poorly lit sets. I can't say the intro was really reassuring me any, with this awful looking text scroll, recycled footage from the first movie, and a pale imitation of the propaganda segments from the first film. But I will admit they do a fairly neat transition from the propaganda to the actual battleground. First impressions, this movie is not a looker by any stretch of the imagination. It runs the gambit of being relatively okay, at least for a budget film, to just really bad. It was filmed digitally, of course, but looking at the camera they used, it seems like it had some decent capabilities. I can only assume they had to shoot this movie quick and dirty, and the cinematographer probably didn't have a lot of opportunity for nice looking shots. Probably didn't help that most of the film is in the dark, and it definitely looks its best when there are more conscious decisions on lighting. The bugs themselves actually look on par with the original movie. Granted, they're often obscured in darkness and dust storms, but they look surprisingly good. I can't even say that the bug combat ratio is lessened by a whole lot. Granted, this movie is about 40 minutes shorter than the first one, but the first 30 minutes of this hour-and-a-half movie is all-out combat. I mean, color me surprised. I thought for sure once they stepped into this abandoned shelter, that would be it. The rest of this movie would just be padding until the climax. But surprisingly, they didn't just go for the bare minimum. Imagine that. I do gotta rag on the action scenes a bit though, because the actual mobile infantry in this movie is a bit lame. Instead of the Marita assault rifle, this group wields energy weapon blaster things. I was confused at the change at first, but then I realized it was actually a good idea, because the prop guns used in this movie clearly don't weigh anything and don't have any moving parts. So if they tried to pass these off as quote-unquote real guns, they would look pretty pitiful next to the original, which actually fired off blanks and had a decent amount of heft to them. It helps alleviate the comparison, but these don't get completely off the hook in terms of the lame factor. The sound effects used are actually pretty decent, but the muzzle flash is not. It also doesn't help when a lot of your actors are wielding them with the conviction of someone half-heartedly playing laser tag. I also noticed this pretty egregious mistake. The VFX artist kept adding the muzzle flash when this lady clearly isn't shooting. To be fair, the dude adding the effects to this movie would have probably considered Bob Cratchit's wages to be a princely sum, so I can't really complain too much that he phoned it in. Due to the nature of this movie, it's a given that none of the cast from the original return, at least not ones that are playing the same character. Now, in most cases with your direct sequel, you would more than likely want at least the main lead to return, but I don't think that's entirely necessary for Starship Troopers because of the massive scale of the bug war. The potential for world building is far greater than most of these cheapo sequels, so I don't really feel cheated. It's kind of like getting mad that Luke Skywalker didn't show up in those Ewok movies. I didn't really expect anyone to come back for this one, nor is it really necessary. I can't really say the cast themselves are that much to write home about, if you have a penchant for writing letters about straight-to-DVD sequels, but it's a diverse enough group to keep things interesting. Our lead characters are Captain Dax, who was found locked up in the abandoned base, the reason for which was killing his superior officer. This was due to the fact that he gave bad orders and got a lot of people killed. Our second lead is Private Lee Sahara, who has basic psychic abilities and is rocking standard issue lip injections. Okay, so obviously this movie isn't going to be about fighting bugs the entire time, but I already alluded to the fact that it wasn't just a bait and switch, with the rest of the movie being padding. Just a forewarning, this movie actually did a good job at keeping me invested, and it had a clever twist. I ultimately came away with thinking that the film was kind of decent for what it is. So if you're inclined to check it out, I just say bow out here, because I'm going to spoil the whole thing. So to recap the events quickly, our mobile infantry squad makes for this outpost, but the general and a few men stayed behind in order to cover their escape. Our main force dukes it out with the bugs and sets up this barrier to keep them out. But not before the general returns, and with him some new people who ended up saving him at the last minute. However, these unknown troops are kinda acting a little off. Surprise, this is actually a horror movie. There's a new bug that possesses you and basically turns you into the Ganados from RE4, or the Majinji from RE5, or the Juavo from RE6. They got a lot of fucking use out of that idea, huh? Anyway, in classic horror fashion, they start picking off the group one by one until only our main heroes are left. Their plan is to get the infected general back to the Federation so he can get high-ranking officials under the bug's control. Hey, that's kind of like Resident Evil 4. Okay, I promise I'll stop talking about Resident Evil. Lord knows I've already talked enough about it. Look, this shit isn't exactly Citizen Kane, alright? But I gotta give them credit. They knew they couldn't compete with a $100 million blockbuster, so they put in as much bug combat as they possibly could and centered the rest of the movie around something they could actually accomplish. And coming in from the first movie, I wasn't expecting a horror twist. That genuinely caught me off guard. Now, if I had a major complaint, it would not be the lack of satire, because as I said before, I don't care. But what I do really miss from the first movie is the comedy, because Hero of the Federation has very little. It's not completely devoid of it. There's a pretty funny scene where one of the original infected has withered away into nothing but a husk, and they're just keeping him in a locker. Not to mention, they actually went to the effort of making a puppet for this, probably because this movie was directed by Phil Tippett, who is a visual effects master. He's probably most famous for working on Star Wars, Jurassic Park, and RoboCop, but he also worked on the first Starship Troopers. That's probably why the bugs look as good as they do in this. So yeah, it's a decent little flick for a direct-to-DVD release. It doesn't really feel like a continuation of the first one, but in my mind that's okay. I think the movie's biggest sin is having that big old 2 in the title. If this was just marketed as some kind of spin-off, I think people would be at least a little more forgiving. Who am I kidding? It doesn't have the epic satire of the original, so even if the movie didn't look like shit, fans would probably still hate it. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, first of all, it's kind of curious that this movie even exists. 2 wasn't exactly hot off the heels of the first one coming out 7 years later, but it was definitely cheap enough to justify its existence. I can't find any sales numbers, but I guess it did well enough to make the third one a far greater endeavor. A significantly increased budget, the return of Johnny Rico, and overall a movie that feels much more worthy to be a direct sequel to the original. It's kind of amazing to me that 10 years later, off the back of a movie that didn't do well at the box office, there was still vested interest in making this. Let's cool our jets though. Even with the increase in budget and the return of Casper Van Dien, I was still skeptical that this one would also be enjoyable. Don't get me wrong, 2 surprised me, but that was only because it intentionally distanced itself from the original movie. This sequel, on the other hand, is now attempting to more closely align itself with the first one, and that's a pretty dangerous thing. I was worried the second was going to be a pale imitation, when in fact, I should have been worried about this one. Initial impressions are mixed. They properly bring back all of the "would you like to know more" segments, which also introduces the new Sky Marshal, who moonlights as a famous pop star, which is quite humorous if I do say so myself. This song also kicks ass.
It's a good day to die when you know the reasons why. The citizens, we fight for what is right. A noble sacrifice. When duty calls, you pay the price. For the Federation, I will give my life.
But we're also introduced to Johnny Rico's quote-unquote old friends. Nice to see they're keeping it consistent with the standard issue lip injections. Wouldn't want to break that lore. Denise Richards would be proud. But it was at this moment I thought I was in trouble. I thought to myself, oh no, is this what we're doing? They couldn't get Denise Richards or Neil Patrick Harris back for this one. Denise was too busy because Madame Tussauds Wax Museum refused to make a sculpture of her, so she figured she would just turn herself into a wax figure. As for Neil, I think we know what he was up to. He was too busy voicing veteran Child in Saints Row 2. Why? What did you think he was doing?
Opinions are like assholes. Neil Patrick Harris wants to stuff...
So they got these two to be stand-ins for those characters, and now we're basically gonna do the original movie over again. They even walk off together like in the first movie. No time for plot though, because it's all hands on deck to fight the bug menace. And I have to say, this leaves much to be desired. As for why, most people would point to the downgrade in CG, and it is true that it's much worse. In fact, it's even a big step down from the second movie, but the rest of that movie did look like complete ass, so I kinda appreciate the more even-keeled approach. What bothers me is the sound design. Despite the fact that they do have hefty blank firing guns again, it's the same cheap sound effect on loop. The bugs also keep emitting the same sound effect constantly. Just ends up being this cacophony of noise, and it's genuinely hard on the ears at times. It also has the effect of making this movie feel cheaper than it is. I honestly feel bad. They went through all the trouble of making a convincing set with good costumes and props, only to have it ruined by poor sound design. However, none of this stuff actually ends up mattering. Because would you believe me when I say this movie also pulls a bait and switch? And after this point, it becomes really good and unique from the original. As soon as shit starts hitting the fan at Rokusan, Captain Beck dips, which I want to read as Captain Beck lips, with the Sky Marshal. But after sustaining fire, they're forced to evacuate and are now stranded on a mysterious planet. But make no mistake, there are bugs here. You figure only armed with 2 assault rifles, they would be killed in about 0.5 seconds. However, for some reason, they're able to skirt by the bugs without much interference. Oddly enough, none of the higher-ups at the Federation seem overly concerned about getting the Sky Marshal back, which is both puzzling and infuriating for Hauser, considering the woman he loves was captain of the ship. Simultaneously to that happening is Johnny Rico being tried for treason, and they aren't exactly being subtle about the outcome. This is a great way of showing the brutality of the Federation. This isn't some random guy, this was the protagonist of the first movie. We've seen his entire military journey play out. Even with that removed, Johnny is a decorated war hero, one who has gone above and beyond the call of duty. He's being repaid for that bravery by being hanged like a common criminal, all because he tried to stop some dumbass on a power trip from shooting a man in cold blood. Now, as an aside, they keep calling Johnny the hero of Planet P, which isn't true, as it was Sergeant Zim who ultimately captured the brain bug. Now, I would just write this off as the writer being lazy, but the writer-director of this movie was the writer for Starship Troopers. So, I'm assuming he knows that. Either he's just like ignoring it for convenience sake, or he's just kind of saying he's also a hero of Planet P. I don't know what to make of that. Regardless of that, this is all to say that the movie pretty much has me hooked. Why aren't the bugs attacking the survivors? Why is the Federation so unconcerned with rescuing the Sky Marshal? Even going as far as to ignore the communique sent by Lola. Is it all a political power play, or is there more to it? And what's gonna happen to my boy, Johnny Rico? This isn't all the movie has going for it though, because it actually fixes a major issue I have with the first film. You see, the oh-so-brilliant satire of the original is that it portrays a fascist society without any kind of condemnation of its practices, aka in its natural element. But once you take a closer look at how the Terran Federation functions, a question arises. Wait, why is this society super bad again? Earth has in fact achieved world peace, and not by tyrannical means either. Everyone appears to just genuinely get along. A lot of emphasis is put into the military, sure, but there isn't a draft nor conscription, forced or otherwise. You can also leave the military anytime you want, no questions asked. Also, last time I checked, wanting a strong military was not exclusive to fascism. Oh, but there's propaganda. Yeah, you got me there. We would never have propaganda to try and trick young and impressionable people into joining the military in current society. That could only be an invention of a hyper-fascist sci-fi future. Maybe I'm just an absolute knuckle-scraping dumbass Neanderthal who isn't media literate. But last time I checked, media literacy just means calling children's programming secretly communist, or gay, or both. So that's not really applicable here. All jokes aside, this is all starting to sound like a certain other Federation. Last time I checked though, the Federation in Star Trek is considered a utopia. It's also not like the Terran Federation is partaking in some kind of unjust military conquest of other planets for oil, unobtainium, or whatever. They were attacked unprovoked by an uncaring hive mind. Gee, that also sounds extremely familiar. And don't spin me that bullshit on how it was a false flag meant to justify going to war. There isn't any evidence in the actual film that backs up that theory. You're genuinely making up shit out of thin air in order to make this movie seem deeper than it actually is. Now, I'm not a complete ignoramus. I do understand that not being able to vote if you don't serve in the military is a big deal, but it's not the end-all be-all. For the most part, it seems like your day-to-day liberties aren't really affected. On top of that, even if you aren't a citizen, there aren't any rules about contributing to elections by donating or campaigning. You might conclude that it isn't ideal, but that doesn't automatically make it fascism. I mean, just think about it hypothetically. Would you give up your inherent right to vote if that meant actual world peace? I'm not trying to say there's a correct answer to that question, but the idea that it's somehow black and white, democracy versus fascism, seems stupid to me. I think a lot of general disconnect comes from how Starship Troopers was adapted from its original source material. Now, if you were paying attention at the start of this video, which, let's be real, most of you weren't, you're probably watching this while getting an MRI test or something. Starship Troopers the book was in fact just a speculative fiction on the future of warfare and society at large. It's essentially a Star Trek-style utopia, but from a more conservative perspective. However, because the basis for the world is indeed utopian, there's no clear line of attack if you want to satirize its concepts by displaying them in a different light. The only way it can accomplish making the Federation look evil is by giving them Nazi-esque uniforms, very on-the-nose propaganda, which doesn't actually have anything to do with the plot, and throwing out little lines here and there.
I want to have babies. You know, it's a lot easier to get a license if you serve, so.
This concept isn't in the book at all, nor is there any kind of expansion of this idea in the actual movie. However, making someone jump through hoops to have a kid seems contrary to a society that wants as many people to join the army as possible. Could it be they added this line without thinking about it to make the Federation look worse? I'll let you be the judge. But the answer is yes. I could go on all day about how the book differs from the movie, and I could more or less combat every recontextualization. But the ultimate point is that in an attempt to challenge the ideas of the book by recontextualizing them, you still end up with a seemingly very progressive society fighting a completely just war. So you end up inadvertently making fascism look like a compelling political ideology, which is exactly the opposite of what they were trying to do. Starship Troopers 3 completely remedies this issue by just biting the bullet and distancing distancing itself from the book. It has the Federation committing genuinely evil acts, death sentences without a trial, a false flag event that's actually in the movie and not just some Redditor's mind, and finally, weapons of mass destruction on unseen scales. This is a far cry from, well, they do propaganda, I guess, and military bad. And this is really how it should have been from the start. I don't care that you were trying to be super clever to get an epic own on Robert Heinlein because you thought he was a poopy head. If the society in your story is meant to be reprehensible, you kinda have to have them do reprehensible things. However, this doesn't mean the movie is suddenly devoid of satire. Things like the propaganda segments still work completely fine. Starship Troopers 3 also brings in its own unique commentary on a new topic, that being religion, and it's a major factor paramount to the movie. We're introduced to it early on, and it seems religion, specifically Christianity in this case, had for a large amount of time faded into the background, and we're now just seeing its resurgence. It's tolerated but generally frowned upon. We also see a former soldier and citizen turned peaceful protester. What's the reason for turning a new leaf? Well, religion, of course. Since the movie has outright portrayed the Federation as evil, we can only come to the conclusion that a concept they oppose is a force for good, and it most certainly appears that way. The peaceful protests definitely seem like they're garnering a lot of steam, to the point that religion is spreading to members of the military. However, the idea that faith is a bunch of hooey is kept up throughout the movie as one of our main characters, Captain Lola, can barely tolerate it, and is outright hostile to one of the other survivors when she starts expressing her beliefs. When the Sky Marshal seemingly expresses the same beliefs, she thinks he's gone completely insane. Eventually, there's a shift, and all the plot points start to converge. The movie then starts to pull a neat trick. You see, the Sky Marshal was not in fact a follower of Christianity. He had been brainwashed by the bugs into believing this thing was God. This is also when the movie starts giving plausible deniability to the Federation's actions. You see, this Admiral lady knew that the Sky Marshal was brainwashed, so that's why they were being so non-committal about saving him. Nothing nefarious here. Even though she did lie to the public, stage a false flag attack, pinning it on peaceful protesters, and ultimately ending up in the position she coveted. Just ignore all that. And Dix totally wasn't gonna let Johnny hang. He needed everyone to think he was dead to stage the rescue mission. Except he didn't find out the fact that there was ignored communique until after the sentence was already agreed upon. Anyway, moving on. The best plot payoff of the movie, though, is definitely the religion angle. This is foreshadowed earlier in the movie when the Admiral comments on the Sky Marshal's devotion to what he thinks is God.
Doesn't protest, doesn't rebel. That's the kind of attitude that wins wars.
Finally understanding that religion can be a powerful tool, instead of trying to stamp it out, she decides to use it for her own gain and spread it throughout the Federation. Satirizing devotion is genuinely used to some great comedic effect, like praying to God as machines of war lay waste to everything around them, and a marriage proposal with the insistence of a traditional church wedding while the biggest bomb ever created destroys the planet behind them. However, what I like most above all with the messaging is that it's not a blanket detraction of religion as a whole. Look, whether or not you subscribe to some kind of faith, I think most of us can agree that the whole ma-atheism, with all its talks of flying spaghetti monsters, putting the Bible in the fiction section, and just general lack of grooming ability, is pretty old hat, and frankly, le epic cringe. This movie, on the other hand, effectively displays a group with absolute power taking a force for good, removing those who genuinely followed the practices, and then twisting the ideals to suit their own purposes. I mean it when I say this is a genuinely well-balanced execution of the idea, and one you would not expect to see in Starship Troopers, let alone the third one. So hot damn, you could definitely call me pleasantly surprised. I was fully expecting to let out my inner nostalgia critic and just take these movies to task the entire time. But I found myself getting a lot of value from them. I'm not gonna call either of these masterpieces, and as much as I appreciate number 3 for the concepts it presents, it still really can't hold up to a movie with a $100 million budget and an extremely experienced director. However, I can't really overstate that there was actual effort put into these movies, and frankly, that's kind of huge when we're talking about this caliber of filmmaking. I can't even really blame these people working on this shit either. I also probably wouldn't be that excited to be on the production team for Bloodsport 4, Legally Blonde 3, or Tremors 7, Jesus Christ. So the fact that anyone tried at all and succeeded to some degree actually made for some engaging movies. Seriously, dude, I would have loved something like the Darkman sequels to have this much effort put into them instead of being on the level with the rest of this trash. And I do find it disheartening how much these two have been written off. I can understand these being extremely under the radar, but the small minority of people that have actually viewed these films don't give them the time of day, and reviewers especially just treat them like they're not even worthy of existing. Give me a break, dude. This series only exists because Verhoeven purposely adapted a book in such a way to make its original creator look like an asshole, so sorry if I don't exactly share the same sentiment that Starship Troopers is somehow sacred. Anyway, I think I've said my piece on the matter.
Please clap.
I know there are 2 other animated movies. I do plan on eventually covering those in its own video. I was about to say because this video is long enough as it is. But I kinda hate it when YouTubers say that because that implies the audience is going to get bored if you keep going. But if you've made it all the way to the end of a long ass video, you're probably just genuinely interested to the point that you would be willing to watch more. So how about this? This video was enough work already, and I don't want to add like another week's worth of editing to that. That sound fair enough? Alright then, see you in the next one, and remember,
the only good bug is a dead bug.
So good day to die, when you know the reasons why. The citizens, we fight for what is right. A noble sacrifice, when duty calls, you pay the price.